From the Central Western Washington area, Choice Regional Health Network presents the Equity Circle podcast, a place for information with integrity, accountability, and innovation. Enjoy the episode.
Good afternoon, listeners, and welcome to the next episode of the Equity Circle podcast. I am so pleased to share with you this afternoon that we are being joined by John Toonheim. He is the elected prosecuting attorney for Thurston County here in Olympia. So, John, please share with our listeners a little about yourself and what you do.
Okay. Well, first of all, pleasure to be here with you. And I'm really excited to talk to your audience about some of the things the prosecutor's office is doing, and perhaps even a little bit about how hope plays into the work that we do. And we'll get to that. But when I decided to get into law school, just a little bit of background, I actually started law school with the intent to become a criminal defense lawyer because I was very interested in criminal justice and criminal justice issues. But in law school, I was guided by a mentor to become an intern in the prosecutor's office here in Thurston County. I was going to law school at the time at Seattle University, or it's actually then was University of Puget Sound Law School. And so I was in Tacoma, and I started working down in Thurston County as a legal intern, and quickly realized that's where I really wanted to be. That's where the influence is in terms of criminal justice policy and how criminal justice is done. And so I stayed on that track. So I actually started in the prosecutor's office in 1988 as an intern, and then was hired as a deputy prosecutor and spent about 20 years in that role. And then in 2010 was elected to office. And so I took office in 2011 as the elected prosecutor. The prosecuting attorney office at the county level, it has two kind of major roles. We are the criminal prosecuting authority for the county for most cases. And when I say most, that includes like all felony cases, misdemeanor cases that occur in the unincorporated areas of the county. Basically, everything that isn't done just by a city municipal court falls into our jurisdiction in terms of criminal prosecution. But we also have a second side of the house, and that is our civil work, which a lot of people don't know about. But we are also the lawyer for county government. And it's the same relationship, say, that the Attorney General's office has to state government. So I have lawyers in my office that represent the elected officials and give them legal advice, and other county offices and so forth. And so we're a multi-function, multi-mission type of organization. My role as the elected leader is really that. I provide the oversight, the leadership of the organization. And of course, I do a lot of the community outreach, community interaction work, program development. All of those kinds of things fall within my purview.
Wow. So that's interesting. You've been doing this work, if I caught you right, for about 10 or 11 years now. Is that correct?
As the elected, and in the criminal justice as a prosecutor, over 30 now. I'm well over 30 years.
Wow. So let me ask you, you've obviously seen a lot of changes probably in the last 10 years just here in your position in Thurston County. What are some of the most relevant changes that the court system has had to adopt due to the pandemic?
Yeah, the pandemic was really a game changer for us, as it was, I think, with probably everybody in some way or another. But for the criminal justice system, we had to really totally rethink how we do business. And some of those kind of age-old ideas of how we do court and criminal justice, we had to essentially disregard and find new ways of doing it. And probably the most remarkable of that is our adapting technology. Courtrooms historically have always been about live interaction, right? People go to court, they are in court, and a courtroom is a big room, right? When people are all together and interacting in obviously a very controlled, highly structured environment. But when the pandemic set in and everybody had to be 6 feet apart, and even beyond that, everybody was being asked to work at home. The courts had to close down completely doing jury trials because we had no way of having a jury brought together. And we had to find a way to do court without having to all be in the courtroom. And so the technology was in my view, the most significant change. So we have created a system of doing court hearings virtually, and maybe only having 1 or 2 lawyers in the courtroom at any time, who are basically just there to help do necessary paperwork and things that have to be done in the courtroom. Outside of that, the lawyers are appearing virtually, the participants are appearing virtually. We've really settled into a rhythm of doing that. The one thing that we could never really, though, get back to was jury trials. There's just so many legal hurdles. It's really, really difficult and perhaps even impossible under current legal structure to do a jury trial virtually. And so we've had to essentially try to do those just by finding spaces big enough, large enough where we can do those kinds of hearings. And we just started those again a few weeks ago. We've had some starts and stops along the way, but the latest Omicron surge, we had to stop again, and then we just got restarted. So it's really had a significant impact on us. And the biggest impact has been a really huge backlog of cases now that have built up that we have not been able to process through because of our inability to have the courts at 100% functionality.
So not only have you had this backlog, but have you seen or witnessed an increase then in any criminal activity in certain areas, felonies, for instance, because of the pandemic?
You know, it's hard to, when you're talking about crime, cause and effect gets really difficult. I'm sure, as you can imagine, crime is a complex social construct. But I will say this: during the pandemic, we did notice a increase in the number of domestic violence cases and child abuse cases that were coming in to the office. Now, sometimes that can be because people who are forced to be in their houses for long periods of time, there might be a higher rate of incidence. Or it could be just that when, say, kids are at home for more time and then come back out again, the reporting goes up. But either way, we did see an uptick in those kinds of cases. But I'll tell you what I'm most concerned about right now is just what's starting to get noticeable in the last few months. And I'm afraid that where we're at is we're actually just starting to see some of the impacts of COVID now that have been kind of building up over the last 2 years, because we are starting to see an increase in things like violent crime. And I'm sure you've heard on the news that gun-related crime is up, particularly in some of the larger counties. And it usually takes a little while longer before it gets to a county of our size. But that is a significant concern I have right now, is that there is an increase out there and we just haven't reached it yet.
Wow. So, John, was it that increase and the changes that have been taking place, is that what got you interested in Snyder's hope theory, or was that something that was a passion of yours prior to the increase in cases and the difficulties with the pandemic?
It's actually been a passion of mine for much longer than the pandemic. And I will say that I'm glad it was, because it was it was really a hope, the hope construct, if you will, the hope theory construct that helped me adapt my leadership to think about strategies to get through the pandemic. So the fact that I had already had this passionate interest in hope theory going into the pandemic, right from the beginning, I was using that as a construct to kind of help me figure out how to lead an office, an organization like ours through this. My interest in hope theory actually started back a couple of years after I took office, so probably 10 years ago now, through my work with crime victims, and particularly victims who had experienced trauma. When I was a deputy prosecutor, I had a focus in my practice, particularly on crimes against children, and then sexually based crimes, and so crimes that involved, some significant trauma with victims. And I've been working with victims for a number of years. And it was that kind of work through work and studying and learning about how trauma impacts people that led me to hope theory, because hope has such a strong is such a strong contributor to people's ability to recover and be resilient in the face of trauma. So that's really what got me into hope theory. And then I carried it forward into looking at all aspects of criminal justice and leadership. And I really feel like it was a pretty valuable tool in my toolbox going into pandemic.
So, John, for the benefit of our listeners who may not be familiar with hope theory as we're talking about it, could you give us a brief description of that hope theory concept that you're referring to?
Sure. So hope theory was it's a positive psychology model that was first derived by Rick Snyder, who you referred to earlier. Rick Snyder was a psychology professor at the University of Kansas, and also a practitioner who became very interested in hope. And he really wanted to look at it from a clinical standpoint in terms of how he might incorporate hope into the care that he was providing to his clients. And but from that stemmed this whole body of research. But what Snyder did was he took some of the early work around hope, the study of hope in positive psychology, and he created a framework and a vocabulary that really helps us better think about and understand this concept of hope. He created a tool by which they could measure hope so that you could actually study it and quantify it. And then really kind of started the work on thinking about how, once you know what hope is and you can measure it, then how could you leverage it actually to improve the lives of people? And so that was the origin of it. Hope theory really stems from this idea that when we think about the future, human beings, we're naturally inclined to want to think about the future. It is something we do very often. In fact, if you spend any amount of time just kind of being mindful, you'll find your mind wandering to the future. That's pretty natural human behavior. And Snyder was asking the question about, well, okay, so when we think about the future, we can be optimistic about the future or pessimistic. And so what is hope when we start talking about those ideas of optimism and pessimism, and the difference between hopeful thinking and wishful thinking? And he basically came up with a definition that tied hope to the idea that we as human beings not only have the ability to think about the future in a positive way, but we have the ability to pursue a future that we desire. Okay, so he defined hope simply as this. This is my simple definition of hope theory. In hope theory, hope is the belief that we can make the future better. Okay, and that's different than optimism, which is just the general belief that the future can be better or maybe will be better, right? Hope is about this idea that we have the power to influence our future. And with that then comes this sense of agency, that as human beings, we have agency, or in other words, the willpower and the desire and the ability to make choices to pursue the future that we desire. And with that, then we have the ability also to create strategies to get there, to see a pathway to the future. Okay. And so Snyder's model is essentially that. It defines hope as this combination of having a specific desired future, which we call goals, basically, having the ability to create a pathway to get there, a mental pathway, which is just a strategy, and also then having the willpower and the mental discipline to pursue that goal and to chase that strategy. And so that's hope theory. It's a combination of goals, pathways, and agency.
Wow. What's I dabbled a bit in psychology myself. I got a second degree in psychology back in college. And so I think about the whole cognitive ability of conceptualizing hope.
Mhm.
And I also look at the fact that it would be a great tool for behavioral health therapists and counselors. So I'm curious, as I'm sure our listeners would be, how do you adapt those concepts into your criminal justice work? The
Yeah.
work that you've been doing, as you mentioned earlier, with people who have been traumatized, especially the cases involving children.
Yeah.
How?
Yeah. So that's, I mean, that's exactly, the question I was asking myself when I was learning about hope theory is this is really exciting to kind of think about hope in this way. And there was a new way of thinking about it in my mind, even though this has been around since the early 1990s. And, the other thing I would say real quickly is that this isn't like a new thing. This is a highly researched area in positive psychology. There's over 2,000 published peer-reviewed studies on hope now in positive psychology, most of which attribute hope to some kind of positive outcome. So it's a very well-researched kind of evidence-based idea right now. But for whatever reason, it's kind of remained more in academic circles and is only now kind of coming out. And that's what a lot of us who are talking about hope theory are talking about is, okay, let's take it out of academia and let's start thinking about how do we apply this, okay? So in criminal justice, there's a couple of things that we're doing. And really the first thing I've been doing is just trying to teach as many criminal justice professionals as I can get in front of these concepts and this framework of hope, just so that they know it, because I want them to be able to also think about how do they apply it in their job. So for instance, I've done hope workshops now with our entire drug court staff in Thurston County, because my personal belief looking at hope and looking at some of the research is that one of the most significant predictors of success in recovery is hope. And so for people who are in recovery, going through a program like drug court, making sure that we're providing them the ability to be hopeful and the tools to be hopeful is important. I've done workshops with most or all of the juvenile justice probation supervisors in the state. They invited me to come out to their state conference and talk to them about hope theory, because as they're working with kids who have become involved in the juvenile justice system, the idea would be to try to, create hopeful environments for them and hopeful cultures in the justice system for them. And now we're even talking about it in other areas of criminal justice, such as our diversion programs and things like that. But the other piece of this is I've also really been doing a lot of thinking and work on bringing hope just into our organization and creating a hopeful culture. I've really focused on this idea of hopeful culture because I think it is of such critical importance when you're talking about organizational health, organizational development, keep building and keeping healthy teams. Hope comes into play in all of those areas, and the research bears that out. And so I'm looking at it not only what can it do to help victims be resilient and overcome the trauma that they've experienced, but also folks who are in criminal justice involved because they've been accused or convicted of a crime. How do we get them on a pathway so that they aren't recidivating in the future? And then ourselves, and how do we keep ourselves hopeful working in a profession where we're also having to deal with lots of potential exhaustion, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, all of those kinds of things.
John, this is really interesting, and I I truly think that we need to do another podcast episode. I think there's more that we could explore here. So if you are up for it, I would love to invite you back as a guest on another episode, and perhaps depending on the feedback that we might get from this episode, we could think about a panel discussion with some of our counselors or therapists on the behavioral health side that could join you in a little bit more in-depth conversation about a culture of hope theory. So uh, I really appreciate you being with us today on the Equity Circle podcast. And
I'm so glad that I was here, and of course,
yeah,
time flies, right? And there's so much more to say. So I'm in. If you want to do another episode, series of episodes, panel, whatever you would like to do, you know where to find me, and I would love to come back and talk more about this.
well, thank you so much, John. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in on this episode of the Equity Circle podcast.